This is one of the best interviews I've seen with a Ukrainian military officer in a long time. It's not that they're usually bad. They just tend to be kind of vague. I guess it's the same when you interview commanders in the U.S. military, but they're always deferring to somebody else or don't necessarily get asked like the more interesting questions, but not here. This was an interview with Lieutenant General Budanov, who is the commander of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate. It's when he was in the United States just a week or two ago, along with President Zelensky traveling to, D.C., New York, United Nations, things like that. And he sat down with Howard Altman of The Drive. And some of these questions I think were awesome, kind of foreseeing the details, if you will, where Budanov was interested in going. So Altman asked, do you still believe that Ukraine will retake Crimea this year, or will a counteroffensive push on until next year? Budanov said, so first of all, the fact itself is that we're engaging the military infrastructure and military targets in occupied Crimea and the occupiers' infrastructure. First of all, the air defense systems themselves are very costly equipment, and it takes a lot of time to produce those, and Russian flags those systems because all this inventory is currently engaged in fighting against Ukraine and also in protection of Moscow. They've taken away air defenses from everywhere else. That is why, naturally, when we engage in another air defense battalion of the Russian military, they need to think about where they can pull those systems from and where they're able to tolerate less defenses in other places. So, look, I like that they pushed on the Crimea thing because there were people inside of the Ukrainian military and in the United States saying Crimea this summer. Summer's come and gone. There's still time to fight. Budanov's going to get into that. It's not necessarily planning to stop anytime soon, but I think that's the kind of question that's worth asking. These expectations were set out there. It does not appear that that we're on track to meet those expectations. What are your thoughts on that? But Budanov does get into this interesting air defense battle that's happening right now because it's not just in Crimea. They're targeting air defense systems all across occupied portions of Ukraine, and as he's going to get into here in a little bit, also inside of Russia. He said the second point in engaging defenses is that we're making those holes in the overall air defense coverage. Those holes are exploited for other things, other strikes, you would imagine. Also, we're depleting their air defense missile stocks because those are not limitless. And from the political standpoint, we're also demonstrating the obvious inability of Russian air defense systems, which respectively makes them less lucrative on the world arms markets. That is a very interesting take for Ukraine to have here. Now, that's something that NATO would love to see and that the United States would love to see, but that's a very long-term view for a country that's in the middle of a fight for their survival, right? I can very much understand the making holes in the air defense network to exploit via other means. I can understand the idea of forcing Russia to determine where they're going to put their air defense assets. That's a very real challenge that has impacts right now. Those all make sense, but the affecting Russia's ability to sell their air defense systems in the global market, that's pretty long-term thinking. I guess, this is also one of those things where that could just be a secondary effect. I'd be hard-pressed to think that that is the primary driver of why Ukraine is doing it, but they're not wrong. I mean, how many times over the past decade has the argument been between the Russian S-300 or S-400 and the U.S. Patriot? We court different countries and like which one's going to be better, and we want that relationship. We want them working with us. We don't want them working with Russia. And every time that one of these systems is defeated, it's an argument for more NATO support in some of these countries that might be looking for that. So Altman continues kind of on that front. He said, and this is part of a coordinated campaign. It's not just Crimea, right? Budanov responds, he says, we have never confirmed attacks on Moscow officially. And it says here in the notes that he laughed after that. All the above mentioned factors clearly coincide with the strikes inside of Russia, especially when we're talking about the obviously decreasing demand for Russian weapons, because when the world sees that some drones are attacking Moscow, nobody wants to buy Russian air defense systems any longer, and that is very painful for them. On a side note, there's a completely opposite situation in terms of demand on weapon systems. There's a very high demand on Ukrainian drones right now. We can't sell these now because they are being used for warfighting, but after the war ends, this will have a lot of meaning. Again, these are pretty big picture, long-term takes. They're not necessarily wrong, but it's interesting, again, to see a country mired in the middle of this conflict. The war is far from over, far from decided, right? And starting to look out to what this might look like for their country going forward. It's not, it is interesting to think that Ukraine could very much be on the forefront of some of this drone technology when the war ends. They're kind of leading that charge in a lot of ways right now, Budanov continues, he says there's a social side of it because now the Russian population and especially large Russian businesses really start to feel the impact of war. Because before that, it was just a war going on TV. Yes, it did have some financial impact on big players, but smaller ones weren't even touched. But demonstrative strikes, such as strikes against Moscow City, the skyscraper district in Moscow, demonstrates to everyone that it now touches upon them. So this was largely the consensus when it came to some of these smaller drone strikes in Moscow over the past few months, because they weren't anywhere near enough to do significant damage, but they were noticeable, right? There were detonations going off in Moscow, and one of the arguments as to why that was being done was just to kind of bring the war home to Moscow and force the people living safely far from the front lines to remember that they are engaged in an ongoing war. So it's, haven't heard this explicitly stated from a Ukrainian official before. Again, they're still not, I guess, technically confirming that this was even them. They're just explaining why it was beneficial to them. Adding to that, Budanov says, besides that, it undermines the belief of the population in an all-powerful Russian regime that is the strongest one in the world. They start asking those logical questions, like, where's our air defenses? They're supposed to protect us. And they start blaming their authorities for that, for stealing the money. The next aspect is strikes against critical military infrastructure. It includes oil refineries that supply fuel to the war fighting, as well as the factories and plants that produce components for military equipment. All makes sense, right? There was an article I talked to recently from a Russian think tank where they said we're not in an all-out war, we're not in a total war. Russia might not be, but Ukraine certainly is, right? Fighting for their survival and doing everything they can to come out on top in this conflict. So everything that is outlined here, the idea of targeting critical military infrastructure, 100% is going to be on the target list. The interesting piece, and it's gotten pushback, really, right? The idea of targeting some of these areas further inside of Russia, like the strikes in Moscow, there's pushback as those are civilian targets. And it's a fine line Ukraine's going to have to walk. I think they've been fortunate at this point. None of those strikes in Moscow have killed anybody. I don't know exactly what the response to that would be. Honestly, at this point in the war, there's so many red lines that have been kind of drawn and then crossed and then nothing happens that I don't think much would come of it, to be honest. But that is something I know. I've seen the arguments against that. People saying they should not be conducting strikes against civilian infrastructure because that's one of the arguments against what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But it's a tough spot. Can totally understand why Ukraine would want to carry those out and the benefits of doing so, quite frankly, bringing the war home to the Russian people. Now, on Friday, September 22nd, there was a Ukrainian strike against the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, Crimea. That happened after this interview was conducted, but the interviewer Altman was able to track Budanov down and ask if he had anything to say about that, to which Budanov simply said, "We just gave some intelligence assistance. We always give 24/7 intel information to the general staff." Now, in that strike, a lot of details still coming out, but the last I saw was that the commander of the Russian Black Sea Fleet was killed, along with 34 more officers and 105 additionally wounded. Which, if accurate, and it's hard to measure this against other things, but that is going to be one of the largest scale decapitation type strikes against a Russian military headquarters, I think, since the beginning of this war. That's a lot of senior officers in one strike. But heading back to the interview, they say, will this make a difference given all these factors and given the difficulty of maneuvering in mud? All these factors was a previous point in the interview. Budanov had talked about the challenge of navigating minefields, Russian artillery, ATGMs, things like that, just the nature of the current fight. To that, Budanov says the Abrams tanks, should be used in a very tailored way for very specific, well-crafted operations because if they are used at the front line and just in a combined arms fight, they will not live very long in the battlefield. They need to be used in those breakthrough operations, but very well prepared. So I would take this as an opinion more than directing how they're going to be used. Again, Budanov is not involved in planning the operational nature of this fight, right? He's on the intelligence side. Certainly well-informed and probably in a lot of those conversations. But just to remember kind of the direction this is coming from, he brings up a great point that they won't live very long on the battlefield if they're just thrown out there. And that's one of these arguments that from the start, every piece of Western military equipment gets hyped up to where like it can't be destroyed or it can't be defeated, but anything going over some of these minefields and then hit with a Russian ATGM is going to be destroyed. Like it might have better survivability of the crew, but these things aren't invincible. And Abrams is not going to hover over a minefield that hasn't been cleared. It's not going to make it out of a team of ATGM gunners hammering down from a couple different sides or multiple Lancet strikes. So The idea that it could be used through breakthrough operations, kind of what you're getting at there is some of these areas behind the Russian main line of defense. If Ukraine is able to break through and exploit those, some of those rear areas, there's fewer minefields. Just from satellite imagery, it looks like fewer minefields, fewer anti-tank ditches, fewer anti-tank obstacles, and more room for maneuver, which it's believed, and we've seen this a little bit towards the front, but Russia has reserves held back there to try to close that gap. So it's possible one of the uses for the Abrams tank is to exploit those breakthroughs, and then as they're advancing forward, their primary threat, very realistically, could be Russian armor. And, in that case, great. The Abrams is a great asset to take on Russian armor. Moving on, Budanov is asked about kind of the toll that some of these offensive operations are taking on Ukrainian forces, kind of hinting at casualties. And Budanov says that he does not have precise numbers of Ukrainian casualties, which he's not going to give it out. I'm certain he's got a good figure of that. Of course, he's not going to give it out. Neither side is giving out their casualty figures, right? So we would not expect any different. He says, but having described the overall realities of our current situation, we're smoothly coming to the conclusion that we will have to change something. The conclusion is that we'll need additional weapon systems and capabilities that could still change the balance we have today. Because looking at the situation solely from the perspective of manpower, if we compare the Ukrainian potential with Russian potential, the Russians have a lot more human resources. That is why we cannot keep on fighting just soldier on soldier. This will not deliver the results we want. It's interesting how this argument has changed throughout the war. At the very beginning, it was very much Russia has so many more people than Ukraine, so if it ends up being a manpower fight in some way, shape, or form, then Russia has this advantage, right? And then that quickly changed to people talking about Russia's declining population and how they can't sustain this. But like right here, come on, we've got the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence saying that Russia has the manpower advantage. This is not a matter of looking 40 years down the road, right? They're looking at the next 6 to 36 months in this conflict kind of thing. And when you look at that window and how that's going to affect the war, that advantage is on Russia's side. So to Budanov's point, they're looking at different ways to adapt to this current fight. I wouldn't read into this necessarily when he says we're fighting just soldier on soldier. I wouldn't take that necessarily to mean that they're trading one for one on the battlefield. I think that would be a bit of an extrapolation, but probably hints that if I had to read into this a little bit, I would say it's Budanov saying the loss rates are not sustainable long term, that they have to shore up how they're fighting this war, recognizing that it could go pretty far into the future. They brought up ATACMS and some of these new weapon systems that may or may not be heading to Ukraine in the near future. And Altman says, what's your argument for why Ukraine should receive ATACMS, which is the Army Tactical Missile System fired out of the HIMARS or the M270 multiple launch rocket system. Budanov says the majority of Russian command posts and logistics storages are beyond the distance of 85 kilometers, which is the maximum range of our current munitions for the HIMARS. The Russians just place command posts and other things beyond those distances, so we don't have anything to reach them. And the situation's the same with Russian aviation at the airfields. Fighting Russian aviation using air defense systems is very costly and ineffective. Aviation should be taken out at the air bases. This was a change we saw not super fast, but pretty quickly after the HIMARS showed up in country and had a pretty significant effect on Russian command and control and logistics networks in the opening few months once they got there. And then there's a lot of different ways to deal with that threat. The way that Russia did in large part was they just moved a lot of those things back. They moved their command posts back outside of the range of HIMARS. They moved their logistics hubs back, and that has an impact on the battlefield. But for now at least, those are in range of other things like Storm Shadows could be used here, the cruise missiles. And when ATACMS or if ATACMS show up on the battlefield, they can do that same thing. And at some point, that distance becomes unsustainable, right? You can't have a command post with any real effectiveness, say 200 miles behind the front, right? You start to lose the ability to actually impact the fight. So it'll push it back again if those arrive in country. And that's kind of Budanov's main argument, as well as probably a bigger one, defeating and destroying some of, these command posts, they get hit, they can move back. But if you hammer an airfield, knock out 5, 10, 15 aircraft in the matter of a few hours, you can't move those back anymore, right? They're destroyed aircraft. So Altman kind of pushes back a little bit here, trying to get Budanov to say whether or not this ATACMS package has been approved. And Budanov's holding strong, but he's asked, how many ATACMS do you think the United States is going to give them? And Budanov's statement is, I can say conditionally that if it's 100 missiles, this won't change the situation, adding that they need at least hundreds. And I think that's, there's another article I saw recently talking about how we need to stop presenting all these things as miracle weapons. And I think this is a good job of pushing back against that. 1 ATACMS is not going to do the trick. And Budanov has that number, at 100, saying that's not going to do the trick. It's these type of strikes, and we're going to get into more of this here in a second, they take time. It's not one strike carried out against one command post and then a front opens up, or you don't knock out one aircraft on one airfield and something changes dramatically. It has to be continued pressure over a long period of time. And to do that, it requires, in a war this size, significant amounts of munition. So when looking at ATACMS, Budanov says hundreds is what they need, which is worth noting. I don't know how many we have in our inventory. We don't put out a lot of super clear information on our inventories of certain weapon systems. So one of the arguments that people have made against sending ATACMS is that it will deplete our stock. I don't know what our numbers look like, but when you start talking about hundreds, I don't know. That might become a conversation then, right? That might be in the realm of, to send that many would significantly deplete what we have available here, or even what we have on hand. But talking about those strikes on infrastructure, Altman asks, will you strike the Kerch bridge again? And if so, what will Putin do? Budanov says, it's not a question of will we strike or won't we strike. We're doing that regularly, so we will finish it. It's just an issue of time. And in terms of what Putin will do, Budanov says he'll get upset again. What can he do? And I mentioned this earlier about the red line. There's been so many that have come and gone that I feel like we have to be really careful with that, because you lose sight of that, and there is a line somewhere where something bigger will happen. Who knows what that could be? Like, we can't assume that it doesn't exist at all. But at this point, repeated strikes against the Kerch bridge, I think Ukraine's just going to keep doing that indefinitely until the thing goes down, right? And honestly, if it's done with an ATACMS or with a Western supplies cruise missile, I don't think it changes the calculus all that much. Again, look at this Storm Shadow strike that killed Russian officials, killed Russian senior military leaders in Sevastopol just last week. Probably get some harsh words from Russia, but that's just kind of the way the war is playing out. Kind of veering a little bit here, Altman asked, were you guys involved with the attack on Wagner-backed militia in Sudan? CNN reported that Ukrainians were likely involved in the attack on rapid support forces with FPV drones. FPV are the first-person view, the ones that are kind of crashed into a vehicle or an area with usually an RPG attached, detonates. Budanov says, I cannot confirm or deny, adding that I answered them then that anywhere across the world we will be seeking and hunting down Russian military criminals, and sooner or later that time will come wherever they are. That is why we shouldn't be surprised when in any territory something happens to Russian military criminals. I haven't dug into that and seen what the evidence suggests as to whether it was Ukraine or not. There's a lot of people around the world that don't like Wagner. So it's not anytime a Wagner force is killed, it's not automatically going to be Ukraine. I'd be a little bit surprised if Ukraine is dedicating resources around the world to hunt down Wagner personnel right now. There's only so many resources, so much time they have available right now, and they've got an invading force inside their country. But again, not something I've dug into, so maybe we'll have to wait and see for more details on that front. And they kind of leave us with a cliffhanger here, right? So Altman asks, who killed former Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin? I'm sure he's looking for a layup, right? It was Putin or something along those lines. A good soundbite you can play. Budanov says, I would not be in a hurry to say that he's killed. I just wouldn't rush with that question. I don't possess any confirmation. Altman says, you don't have any confirmation that he's dead yet? And Budanov says, we do not possess that. Now, I don't know that Russia has all of that information, right? They have the DNA samples supposedly they took from the crash site, all of the remains from the crash site. Russia has all of that. And I guess there's no reason to expect that Russia would share that. Now, kind of stepping back, I think it's obvious that I don't have anywhere near the amount of information that the head of Ukrainian intelligence does. But I guess I just don't really understand the point of fanning that and kind of throwing out there or suggesting, even in the slightest, that somehow, somewhere, Prigozhin might still be alive. But who knows? Keep an eye out. If you see him, let me know. But that's all I got for now. I will link the article in the description below, along with the national security updates I put out on Substack each week. It's 7 to 10 of the top national security stories, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.